Hello and welcome, I'm Tefera Gedamu. My guest today, Dan Connell, has extensively written on Eritrea for the last 40 years, and he still does. What is the state of Eritrea like today? Why so much movement of people across borders? And what does the future hold for that country? These and more in my conversation with Dan. A very warm welcome to the program.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
For a start, I want to focus on refugees. I'm talking about Eritrean refugees. You've spent a few years working on that very subject. Give me a sense of direction.
Well, if you wanted to map the Eritrean exodus over the last decade or more, you would actually need a globe and not a flat map, because they have gone in almost every direction you could imagine. It's quite remarkable, actually, that a small country like Eritrea with 4 to 5 million people has the second largest population getting into Europe, for example.
After Syria, you mean?
After Syria. And as a producer of refugees, it is up there in a category behind Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria. The ingenuity of the refugees, I think, is a reflection perhaps of the potential loss to the country itself. People are well known for traveling across the Sahara and taking enormous risks at going across the Mediterranean. But they also go through Turkey and Greece and on foot through the Balkans, sometimes landing in prison for months at a time on the way, and at great risk that direction. They go south into other parts of Africa and fly across to South America and then come up through South and Central America to try to get into the U.S. through the back door, risking kidnapping, ransoming, and worse by the drug smugglers that control those routes. And of course they're as far as Australia, New Zealand, and China. So in almost every direction you'll find Eritreans today on the move.
It all starts, in the Sudan?
The Sudan and Ethiopia, and Djibouti.
And Ethiopia and Djibouti.
And in fact, in the last 5 weeks, I visited all 3 of those states. I started this segment of my work in Djibouti about a month or so ago, and then a week in Sudan, and then 3 weeks here in Ethiopia. They go out through whatever route is available to them. Small numbers go to Djibouti. Djibouti, of course, is in a hostile relationship with Eritrea in the same sense, I suppose, that Ethiopia is, of a kind of no peace, no war situation. They go into Sudan and often now go from Sudan back to Ethiopia, as well as off to Libya. So these are the first points, the destinations.
Is it a word of mouth? Why would they want to take that risk to be able to get to Europe and North America or whatever it is?
That's the essential question.
Wouldn't that be enough to stay, for example, in the Sudan or in Ethiopia? Why do they take that risk?
Well, I think the questions I've been asking people, and I started this actually talking with refugees in North America and Europe.
The ones who've made it.
The ones who have made it, obviously. And why did they leave? Why did they move on? How did they do so? And what has been the reception at the end? And why they left, the answers are relatively consistent. There is the endless national service, which many view as a kind of forced labor for half their lives. It can be 10, 12, 15 years. In menial positions with subsistence pay, forcing them to be subsidized by parents whom they should be supporting.
Shouldn't crossing the border to Sudan or to Ethiopia, shouldn't that have been enough for them? Why would they take that risk?
Once they get outside, they're leaving because all options seem to have been closed to them where they live. If they end up in a desert refugee camp, say in Sudan, or in a camp in northern Ethiopia, in the Tigray region or the Afar region where I've just been, and they find themselves again in a situation where there's no opportunity for personal advancement or income to send back to their parents, and again they're stuck, they feel a desperate push to go on to the next step. And each time they take a step further, they get into a more dire situation. I think it's well known that there are great dangers in crossing the Mediterranean. But many of the Eritreans that I've talked to who are in Ethiopia or Sudan and contemplating that are not aware of the degree of risk they face in just getting through Sudan and getting through Libya itself.
Really? I thought it was public knowledge.
You would be amazed at how many young people will say to you, I know people who have made it to Europe, they're doing very well, this isn't going to happen to me. And just last week I was in the Hitsats camp up in the Shire area in Tigray, and talking with a group of kids, 10, 12, 13 years old. Some of them had come out in search of brothers or sisters that they thought they would find, and of course they were gone. Some of them had just been following their friends, but they were convinced that if they continued on, there was some golden pot at the end of the rainbow here. And so I started talking to them about what they could face when they try to get across Sudan. The fact that there are gangs that can capture them from Chad along the way and ransom them. That there are militias and gangs within Libya. They had no clue. They had no idea.
Take the risk.
Take the risk. They're being pushed. And I think there's a kind of a myth, and I think many Europeans have been reinforcing this, that somehow conditions are so good in Europe that it's pulling people. I found the reverse is true, that it's the push, first from Eritrea, then from the refugee camps and onward, that makes the difference. Now, in my view, if the Europeans were investing in the camps in Ethiopia and Sudan, and investing in education, training, and also work, because training without a job at the end is really worthless. This might stabilize the flow and keep people in the region, and this, I think, in the end, would be the best thing for everybody, because it positions these kids to go back home and rebuild the country when things finally change in Eritrea.
The reasons for crossing the borders?
The National Service is the best known, and people talk about it a lot. But when I press people really about what was it that you were in National Service, say, for 4 years, what made you decide finally to go, you start hearing stories of physical abuse, public humiliation, beatings, and other things based upon real or often imagined transgressions. There are no trials, there are no hearings, there's no accountability for this. But there's been a kind of culture of violence that has now imbued the Eritrean Defense Forces, the security forces, and there's absolute impunity for people who carry out such acts against people. So it's often the abuse and violence of the experience, as well as the endless nature of it. I've also talked to dozens and dozens who have been thrown in prison for often accusations never proven, that they have thought of leaving, or they've assisted somebody else, or they prayed when they shouldn't have prayed, or they were part of a religious group that was banned in the country, like the evangelical Protestants. And they've ended up in a series of prisons, sometimes for several months, sometimes for 5, 6 years. They just get lost in this. So there's a whole range of political pushes as well as simply the National Service.
You're talking about able-bodied people, men and women.
Yes.
But what about the minors? I mean, there are unaccompanied minors who cross the border. There are people as older, 75, 80 who've crossed the border, so we hear, and so on. What is the reason for the migration of these people?
If you look at the demographic, the 18 to 55-year-olds make up 2/3 to 3/4 of those coming out. If you go to camps up in the Tigray area, and you go into Mayani or Adi Harush or these others, you see young men everywhere. It's not the kind of refugee situation you would encounter in Jordan or Lebanon, where you'd see whole families, or for that matter in the Afar region of Ethiopia, where you see whole families coming in. It's young people in a very distinctive situation. The addition of all these kids comes in part, as I said, out of a sense of loss of family. They've lost a father, they've lost a brother who have disappeared in this way, and they're following. Sometimes it's just kids who live in a border area and see other people leaving and decide to try it. Some of those children could be repatriated, and the International Committee for the Red Cross is now starting to look into this. Some of them have older brothers and sisters who have been in national service, and they don't want to go there.
Speaking of the demographics, it's largely highland Eritreans who are crossing the border, who are migrating, who are refugees, right?
It depends on where you're looking. In Sudan, you'll see lowland Eritreans from western Eritrea coming across as well, although there's a steady stream of highlanders into that mix. In the Tigray area, you're seeing people coming from the border areas and from Asmara. They're mostly Tigrinya speakers. They're also Saho and Blin and others. Then there's a whole other stream of people coming out of southeastern Eritrea from the Afar region into Ethiopia's Afar region. And I was just there 2 days ago. The Afar situation is different in some respects. You see, instead of individuals moving out and imagining that they're continuing on to Europe, whole families come out. And communities get together on the Ethiopian side of the border within the refugee camps, recreating the community they left. Those people are more likely to stay here.
They're like the Kunamas are.
Like the Kunama. The Kunama and the Afar, I think those two have a distinctive experience. They've gone through everything the Tigrinya speakers have gone through in terms of political repression and manipulation, with the additional fact of ethnic discrimination and in some cases, persecution for following their own traditions and cultures.
When was it? Last week, the UN Commission of Inquiry on Human Rights in Eritrea, the report was published. We have gruesome picture of Eritrea. Human rights abuses in the country were occurring on a scope and scale seldom witnessed elsewhere. I mean, that is quite a verdict, is it not?
I've read the short form of the report and a good part of the long form, the 484 pages of it. What I'm finding in that report are much the same kinds of things I've been reading about. The consistency is overwhelming in one sense, but at the same time, I think it tells you something about what's going on. These are not abuses. They're not excesses. These are not situations where you find an individual who has misbehaved and you punish him. This is a system. It's a system that I would liken to Pinochet's Chile, or the dictatorship in Argentina or Bolivia that we saw in the 1980s, and in Brazil. I'm more familiar with the Americas, where terror and fear were used to basically cow a population into submission. And I think to a certain extent that's what's been going on in Eritrea. The stories you hear about individual acts of violence and punishment are horrifying enough. But if you look at that pattern, you'll also hear stories about people who are arrested and disappear, never charged with anything, sometimes aren't even interrogated, held for a month, 2 months, 3 months, and then released. Somebody else disappears and comes back. The idea that anybody can be taken at any time for something you don't even know what you've done is a way of building submissiveness into a population. And I think this is part of a conscious effort to basically control and exploit a whole population.
Is this something that has surfaced in the last 10 years, or it was there in the very psyche of the liberation movement way back in the 1970s and so on?
You know, I think every armed liberation front that has made a transition into governance has had problems with that transition, and many don't do a very good job of it because you have entrenched habits of control. Secrecy is essential for survival. A whole set of habits and values that are good for winning a war, but bad for running a country. And when you take that movement wholesale and turn it into a government with no other input from outside, I think you're setting a situation up that is going to curdle and corrupt from the inside. In this,
so there is, what you're saying is there's something you know now that you didn't know then.
And I think also there are tendencies within this particular political movement that have been manifest since the 70s. The famous Menka incident back in 1973. There was first a leftist movement, the Menka, and then a rightist movement known as Yamin, which were crushed inside the movement by the execution of people, many of whom had been close comrades and friends from childhood. there's a modus operandi here that runs all the way through the EPLF's history of a kind of absolute control from within and harsh punishments for anybody who steps out of line. I don't think they're the only movement to have done this. If you look at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission process in South Africa, which we could come back to, is going to be needed in Eritrea too. But you find that there was torture and other very reprehensible acts taken by the ANC and some of the camps outside too. This kind of thing happens within a movement. That's not to justify it, but it's to say that you start with it. The problem comes when there's no accountability, when there's no openness to even talk about what did happen, to know about it, and when the truth itself and history is controlled by the same people that are controlling the population in the name of a government, there's no way to bring about a change.
You've been writing on and about Eritrea for the last 40 years, on and off. For example, against all odds, where you romanticize the Eritrean revolution. Looking at it now, do you regret the fact that you didn't look into those things that you're just telling me now?
I regret the extent to which I set aside contradictory images that I was seeing. I don't regret my presentation of the liberation struggle itself, which I continue to think was a remarkable movement with enormous potential to have gotten somewhere else than they did. I think that when I look back at my own experience here, the points that I would stop at were 1991, when the liberation struggle was over. Now they were building a new country. The excuse that they had to be so strict and so disciplined, punishingly so, during the liberation struggle was no longer valid, and they didn't let the ELF come back into the country. They didn't let other nationalists from other rival movements into the country to participate in that. That was a signal that this was not going to be an inclusive nation-building project. And after that, there were individual issues that came up again and again, NGOs that were started, daycare centers by former fighters that were shut down by the movement because they couldn't tolerate anything they didn't control. I did criticize that behind closed doors. It needed to be out in the open. There was a turning point that I reached, actually, where, you struggle for a long time, as members of the so-called G15 did too, with the idea that if we can only get to a place where there is a rule of law and a constitution, there will be an arena in which these things can be struggled out. And after a while, you say to yourself, that keeps receding somewhere into the future. Maybe we're not going to get there. For me, in 2001, I was sitting in the Ambassador Hotel in Asmara at a time when they were celebrating the 10th anniversary of liberation. Everybody knew that there were things going on inside the regime that were turning uglier and uglier, and that a purge was coming.
That was the year...
That was the year that the arrest of the G15 came, but we're talking now 3 months ahead of time. I was sitting there, and when a young boy came up to me, as has happened to me often, who said, you may not remember me, but I met you in 1977 at the Wad Sharifa refugee camp in Sudan. And he said, my family had just come out from Asmara, and we continued on to the Netherlands, where I've lived ever since. And it was through your reports that I found out what was going on inside my own country, and it inspired me to become a journalist. I was very touched by this, right? Then he turned around to me and he said, I know you know what's going on here now. We need you to say something. And I had to look at myself in the mirror and say, what are you waiting for? The next day I went out and did an interview with one of the local papers, got called into the PFDJ for saying things critical of the government, continued to speak out after the arrest of the G15.
Whom you interviewed for you?
Well, and that started really in the year 2000, a year and a half before the arrest. And it started with my getting very disturbed by what I was seeing in the country and in the conflict with Ethiopia and the conduct of the war and of the so-called peace negotiations, which never seemed to go anywhere. And I began to think that the secret party that had been running the EPLF was a key to understanding how this movement worked. So I started asking questions about it, the Eritrean People's Revolutionary Party. And that opened up the whole issue of how Isaias and the core of people around him had been manipulating organizations within other organizations throughout their political careers. I started that conversation with Haile Duro Wolde-Tensai, who had been a key figure in that party and who was happy to start talking about it and also to start looking critically at his own role in this process. It led to other conversations with other people in the leadership about the debates that were taking place then inside the movement. And then in January of 2001, 9 months before the arrests, I started having conversations with people who knew they were going to get arrested, who knew they were going to get taken out by Isaias because he clearly doesn't tolerate division or dissent within his own movement. And this was out of his control at that point.
And they wanted their version of the story told.
They wanted the story told, so they started opening up to me. They were sitting in Asmara in a situation where the PFDJ was starting to organize debates among mid-level cadre to prepare them for the arrest of the leaders. This is the way the movement has behaved for many years. So 9 months away, they saw it coming. They wanted to get the word out. And I think that in part they hoped that there would be some response from the public and some challenge to Isaias. And in that respect, they were naive, and probably so was I.
So after their arrest, the book came out, you were PNG'd, conversations with Eritrean political prisoners.
It didn't come out until 2004.
But they knew that you interviewed them and you had your fallout. You followed the government?
Petros Solomon's house was right across from the Niala Hotel in the middle of Asmara, and they watched the house every day, so they knew what I was doing.
And then you were PNG'd since, what, 2002? Never returned to Eritrea?
No.
So whatever information you have about Eritrea
it all comes from people who have come out.
What is the fate of Eritrea? What do you see happening? What do you see coming down the road? Here is a country that's pretty much isolated.
It's quite isolated, and it's also increasingly internally divided. One hears more and more discussions about the problem is this ethnic group or this region or even this community. And I think that's a very dangerous trend, and it suggests a kind of fragmentation of the center. I don't, however, think that Eritrea has the Somali experience or the Libyan experience in its future. I think there's too strong a sense of identity, and I also think there is a latent, if you will, desire to really get beyond the situation that will mitigate against violence within the country. But it's very hard to predict what will happen there because this government is really a liberation front masquerading as a government without the kinds of institutions that can outlive the people who are now running the country, which leaves Eritrea in a very fragile situation. The worst case scenario here is that the divisions between highland, mostly Christian Eritreans, and lowland, mostly Muslim Eritreans gets wider, and that turns into a fault line within the society. I still have hope that Eritrea will pull itself back together again. I have enormous faith in the people of the country to resume the process of building a dynamic multicultural society. And I actually think that in the long term, Eritrea and Ethiopia and the other countries of this region together can produce something quite dramatic and constructive for the continent and for the world.
Well, let's end the discussion on that positive note. Thank you very much indeed. It was a pleasure having you on my show.
Pleasure to be here.
Thank you.